Yeah. Welcome back to the channel. And today we focus on the nervous system. Now, the nervous system basically focuses on communication that occurs in the body, how the brain commands different parts of the body, and how different messages are sent throughout the body. So that is going to be our focus, more or less. Right. Now, when we talk of the nervous system as a whole can be divided into two different types of nervous systems. The first of which is what is referred to as the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is made up of only two parts. And the parts that make up the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. So these are the two parts that make up the central nervous system. Now, we can also abbreviate the central nervous system as just CNS. That simply stands for the central nervous system. Right. We also have a second type of nervous system, which we refer to as the peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system is made up of what we call the spinal and the cranial nerves. We can also abbreviate this peripheral nervous system as just PNS. Now, it is very important to be able to distinguish between the two. Specifically with the word spinal, it tends to cause a lot of confusion, where learners will see the word spinal and simply think that it has to be part and parcel of the central nervous system. So it is important to distinguish between the two. One more time. The central nervous system is made up of two parts, which is the brain and the spinal cord. But with the peripheral nervous system, it is made up of spinal and cranial nerves. So the spinal, that is related with the peripheral nervous system, it is not the spinal cord, but rather the spinal nerves. Right? Now, when we talk of the nervous system as a whole, for the nervous system to be able to function optimally as it was meant to, for the body to be able to communicate, we need what is called a neuron. When we talk about the neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system. So without the neuron, the body will not be able to communicate. Messages would not be able to be sent from different parts of the body to the brain and vice versa. Right? So, when we talk of this neuron, that we describe as being the functional unit of the nervous system, we immediately come to the fact that we've got three different types of these neurons, starting with the first one, which is called the sensory neuron, the second one being the interneuron, and the third one being the motor neuron. We're going to focus on these types of neurons in detail later on. We will see their structures and also try to label the different parts making up these neurons. Right? So the neuron, this is the functional unit of the nervous system. Without the neuron, the nervous system does not function. We've got three different types of neurons. It is the sensory neuron, the interneuron, and the motor neuron. Right? So let's continue. Now, let's try to explain how you come to feel or detect certain things. Now, what I'm trying to explain here is what is called a reflex arc. A reflex arc is described as being the path that is being taken by an impulse to bring about a reflex action. But that is still a very vague definition at this stage. So let's try to put some meat into that definition. Let's take, for example, you are cooking. You are cooking pap, right? And when you are cooking, you have to hold the pan with a cloth so as to prevent yourself from burning. But if by chance the cloth was to slip away and you are left exposed to the metal, you are going to be burnt. But when you release your hand from the hot surface, from the hot pan, you do not think of removing your hand from the hot surface first. You remove your hand before you even think about it. So this is what we call a reflex action. This is something that your body does automatically. Why does it do this action automatically? So as to limit bodily harm. Right? So now let's try to explain how come you are able to lift your hand from the hot surface without thinking about it? Now, our first player here is obviously the hot pen. When you touch the hot pen, you are going to feel that this pen is hot. And how are you able to feel that the pen is hot? We come to the idea of what is called a receptor. Now, a receptor is responsible for detecting a stimulus. What is a stimulus? A stimulus is anything that causes a reaction. So here what is going to be causing you to lift your hand from the pen is going to be the fact that the pen is hot. So there is heat. So these receptors that are going to be in your hand, they will detect the stimulus of heat that is coming from the pen. Because remember, we said that a stimulus is anything that causes a reaction. So what is causing a reaction here is heat that is coming off from the pen. Right. When this receptor is detected that you are touching a hot surface, there is heat, it has got one very simple function. And the function of this receptor will be simply to convert that stimulus into what we call a nerve impulse. Again, the stimulus in question, it is what you call heat because the pen is hot. But when this receptor has detected that there is heat, it will convert this heat. What is to convert? To convert simply means to change from one form to another. So then, this stimulus of heat is going to be converted, and it is going to be converted into what we call a nerve impulse. Now, what is a nerve impulse? A nerve impulse will simply be a message. It will simply be a message. So this receptor will convert the stimulus of heat into a nerve impulse. The message will be saying you are touching a very hot surface. And this message has to travel until you are able to react to this stimulus. Right? Now, in order for you to be able to react to this stimulus, this nerve impulse must travel to a part of your body that we call an effector. An effector, this will be the part of the body that will enable you to remove your hand from the hot surface. So since you are touching the hot surface using your hands, it will be the muscles in your hand. So once this nerve impulse, once this message reaches the effectors, once it reaches the muscles in your hand, you are going to be able to lift your hand from the hot surface, and this is going to occur very quickly. Right. So we need to follow the path that is taken by these nerve impulses until they reach the effector, after which you will be able to lift your hand from the hot surface. Right. So again, the receptor will receive the stimulus. Once it receives the stimulus, it will convert that stimulus into nerve impulse. A nerve impulse, remember, it is a what? It is a message. And this message, it is electrical in nature. It is electrical in nature. So it will be converted into that nerve impulse. The nerve impulse is a message, and that message is electrical in nature. Right. Once the nerve impulse has been produced, it is going to be transmitted by what we call the sensory neuron. This is our first type of neuron. And this neuron basically deals with sensation. We're going to describe that later on. So once the receptor forms the nerve impulse will be transmitted from the receptor by this sensory neuron. So where does this sensory neuron transmit this nerve impulse to? The nerve impulse is going to be transmitted into the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord, we know that it is part and parcel of the central nervous system. So it is also correct to say that the sensory neuron will transmit the nerve impulses from the receptor to the spinal cord or to the central nervous system. That statement is still true. Now, what will happen once the sensory neuron transmit these impulses to the spinal cord, to the central nervous system? Now, in this part that we call the spinal cord, we are going to find our second type of neuron that we refer to as the interneuron. Now, the interneuron is only found inside of the spinal cord. Now, the function of the interneuron that is found inside the spinal cord is simply to transmit impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, and this happens inside of the spinal cord. Why does it happen inside of the spinal cord? Simply because the interneuron is only located inside of the spinal cord. So, once the sensory neuron is able to transmit that nerve impulse to the central nervous system. In the spinal cord, we're going to find this interneuron. And the function of this interneuron is simply to carry these nerve impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor, right? So now, once the interneuron has been able to transfer these nerve impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, what happens? This third type of neuron that we call the motor neuron will therefore transmit these impulses from the spinal cord, from the central nervous system to the effector. Now, remember, we said that the effector, these are muscles that enable you to react to the stimulus, right? So because you're touching the hot surface using your hand, these will be muscles that are located in your hand. We call them the effectors. They're the ones that are responsible for bringing about an action, right? So once these effectors are able to receive these impulses from the motor neuron, they are able to bring about a response to the stimulus. So in this sense, as soon as the nerve impulses that were initially generated by this receptor are able to be transmitted first from the receptor to the sensory neuron, from the sensory neuron to the interneuron, from the interneuron to the motor neuron, from the motor neuron finally to the effector. So once these nerve impulses are able to be transmitted from the receptor to the effector, it is only then that you are going to be able to respond to this stimulus. This is when you are going to be able to lift your hand from the hot surface. Now remember, this is a reaction that occurs extremely quickly. You do not have to think about it. It occurs automatically. Now, because it occurs automatically without yourself having to think about it, we therefore refer to it as what we call a reflex action. We refer to it as a reflex action. Now we've got two terminologies that sound very similar but are different. The first terminology is this one that we refer to as the reflex arc. The reflex arc describes the path that this nerve impulse will take in order to bring about a reflex action. So when we talk about the path, we're going to talk about the nerve impulses generating from the receptor to the sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and the effector. This is the path that is taken by these impulse in order to bring about a reflex action. So we refer to this path as a reflex arc. But when we talk of a reflex action, we're talking of a rapid. Rapid simply meaning this is a process that occurs extremely quickly. And it is also automatic. By automatic, we're simply saying you do not think about it. It occurs on its own. It occurs naturally, right? So this is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. So the stimulus that we'll be responding to in this sense will be heat, right? So a reflex action, it is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. That is the difference that exists between a reflex arc and a reflex action. Now, we may be asked to explain a reflex action for a particular scenario. Now, what is most important here is to note this reflex arc. It is to note the path that the impulses will take until they reach the effector. But there is still a small issue to address when we talk of the receptor. Now, what is so special about the receptor is that it changes name depending on what the stimulus is. Let's take this example. If you are cooking again and you touch that hot surface, the stimulus that you are going to detect in that instance will be heat. So we'll therefore name this receptor a heat receptor. So the name of the receptor depends on the name of the stimulus. So we'll call it a heat receptor. If it was a cold surface, therefore we'll call it a cold receptor, right? If you stepped your foot on a nail or something, then you're going to feel pain. Therefore, this receptor will therefore be titled a pain receptor. So the name of the receptor depends on what the stimulus is. So when you explain, it is important to note that it will be the heat receptor will detect the stimulus. Once it has detected the stimulus is going to be converted into a nerve impulse, and then you follow this, right? So that is how you describe a reflex action. We'll focus on it on another video. Let's continue. Now, let's try to look at the different structures of these neurons that we're discussing. We already said that the first neuron is going to be the sensory neuron. Now, why do we say the sensory neuron is the first neuron? This is simply because we know that nerve impulses originate from the receptor, because the receptor is the one that is responsible for converting the stimulus into a nerve impulse. Now, once that nerve impulse has been formed, it is going to be transmitted first by the sensory neuron. Of the three types of neuron, the one that is going to transmit the impulses first is going to be the sensory neuron. Hence, I'm saying that sensory neuron is the first neuron. Right. So, this is a typical structure of a sensory neuron. Right. Of course, we must be able to label the different parts and also state their functions. So we've got these things at the end here that are referred to as the dendrites. From the dendrites, we've got this big annular circle here. This is what we call a cell body. Now, inside each and every cell body, we've got a nucleus. And outside the nucleus, we've got our cytoplasm. Now, we've got the part that is inside of this sensory neuron. It basically looks like this, right? So it looks something like this. I'm very bad at drawing, please do forgive me. So we've got this middle part. The middle part in this neuron, we call it an axon. It is what is called an axon. So it is somewhere in between here as indicated by this diagram, right? And then we've got this layer that is surrounding the axon. And this layer that is surrounding the axon is what we call the myelin sheath, right? It is what we call the myelin sheath. Now, the labeling for these neurons are almost identical with the interneuron and also the motor neuron. They are identical, right? So we're only going to focus on the labelings in this diagram, and then we'll only look at the diagrams of the interneuron and the motor neuron respectively after. Now, let's talk about this part that is referred to as the dendrites. Now, the function of the dendrites is that the dendrites, they simply transmit impulses towards the cell body. So they transmit impulses in the direction of the cell body. This tells me that my nerve impulses will originate from a receptor that is somewhere here. So if this is my receptor, then the nerve impulses in question will originate from this receptor and then are going to be transmitted from these dendrites towards the sensory neuron, right? So it will be transmitted towards the cell body. So if I was to talk about the direction in which these impulses are being transmitted, they will be transmitted from left to right in the screen. And the reason why I'm saying they're being transmitted from left to right is simply because the function of the dendrites is to transmit impulses towards the cell body. So since the cell body is towards the right of this dendrite, then the transmission of impulse has to be from left to right. Now, as opposed to the dendrite, we've got this part that we refer to the axon. Now, the axon functions opposite to the dendrite. So if the dendrite transmits impulses towards the cell body, the axon transmits impulses away from the cell body. So that is how the axon functions. It functions opposite to the dendrite. So the dendrite transmits towards, but the axon transmits away from the cell body, right? And then we've got the cell body as it is. There's no real need to know the function of the cell body, but with the nucleus, we know that it contains genetic material always. Now, let's try to focus on this part that is called the myelin sheath. Now, this is a very important part to note. Now, the myelin sheath is going to have two functions. Function number one is said that the myelin sheath acts as an electrical insulator. When it acts as an electrical insulator, it prevents what is called a short circuit, right? So it acts as an electrical insulator, therefore preventing a short circuit. But number two, it is said that this myelin sheath functions to speed up the transmission of nerve impulses. I'm going to repeat that. Function number two, it is being said that the myelin sheath function to speed up the transmission of nerve impulses. So the mere presence of this myelin sheath in any neuron ensures that the nerve impulses are being transmitted very fast. because its function is to speed up the transmission of those impulses. Right? We'll explain the significance of this very soon. So the myelin sheath has got two functions. Function number one, it is going to act as an electrical insulator, which prevents a short circuit, and it is also going to speed up the transmission of impulses. Right. And then here at the end, we've got the axon terminals. These are the axon terminals. This is the end. This is the end of these sensory neuron. So these axon terminals are going to be able to transmit these nerve impulses to the next neuron, right? We'll talk about this when we focus on a synapse. Now, let's come back to this part that we call the axon. Now, the axon is said to be specifically adapted. It's specifically adapted because it is very long. When we talk about this part that is referred to as the axon is said to be very long. Now, why is it important for the axon to be very long? It is very long because it can transmit impulses over long distances. So that is a special adaptation of the axon. So the axon is very long. Why is it long? Because it transmits impulses over long distances. Right? So these are basically the structures that you need to be able to label and also state the functions of. So this is a typical structure of the sensory neuron, and you are able to see that this is the sensory neuron because the cell body is located in the middle of the neuron. Let's continue. Now we come to our neuron number 2. Neuron number 2 is what we call the interneuron. It is important to note that the interneuron, we said that is only located inside of the spinal cord. And its sole function is simply to transmit impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. And this transfer has to occur inside of the spinal cord simply because it is located inside of the spinal cord. So this is a typical structure of an interneuron. Its labeling is similar to that of the cell body that is found in the sensory neuron. So we're not going to spend much time on this one. Let's continue to the motor neuron. Now, this is a typical structure of the motor neuron, and you are able to distinguish it immediately from the sensory neuron simply because in the motor neuron, the cell body now is located towards the end or towards the start of the neuron, as being opposed to being located in the middle, as is the case in the sensory neuron, right? So the cell body here is towards the start or the end of the neuron. So this is a type of neuron that we refer to as the motor neuron. So let's try to put labelings on these different parts. But remember, the functions are identical to the ones that we mentioned when we talk about the sensory neuron. So number A here will be our dendrites. Number A will be our dendrites. Remember, we said that the function of the dendrites is simply to transmit impulses towards the cell body. When we look at part B will simply be the nucleus. That is the nucleus of the cell body. From the nucleus, we look at part F. Part F is pointed towards the middle of this cell body. So that is our cytoplasm. Part F will be our cytoplasm. From part F, let's look at part E. Part E simply shows our cell body. Part E simply shows our cell body. Let's look at part C. Part C focuses on this middle portion in the middle of this neuron. So this is what we call our axon. That is our axon. When we look at part D will be our myelin sheath. Part D will be our myelin sheath. Now remember, the function of the axon is transmit impulses away from the cell body. So again, in this neuron, the transmission of impulses will be from left to right because the cell body is here and the axon is here. And the function of the axon is simply to transmit impulses away from the cell body. So impulses are going to be transmitted from left to right. The myelin sheath, as we've already said, it has got two functions. Function number 1, it acts as an electrical insulator, preventing a short circuit. And number 2, it also speeds up the transmission of nerve impulses. Let's continue. Now let's look at the adaptations of the neuron. Now when we talk about adaptation, these are basically the function of the different parts that are located on that neuron. Hence, we're going to be repetitive. So the dendrite, as we've already said, it transmits impulses towards the cell body. The axon transmits impulses away from the cell body. Now, we've already discussed how the axon is structurally suited for its function. We already said that the axon is long. Why is it long? So that it can transmit impulses over long distances. Right? So this is what we've already specified. Now, the nerve endings transmit impulses to the next neuron. This is done by the axon terminals, where they are going to be able to transmit the impulses from this neuron to the next. And this is where the idea of a synapse is going to come into play. Again, we're going to discuss that. Right? And now we've got the myelin sheath. I've already said the myelin sheath is an electrical insulator, and it also speeds up the transmission of impulses. So these are adaptations of the different parts that are located on the neuron. Let's continue. Now, let's talk about a synapse. Now, when we talk of a synapse is said to be a microscopic gap that exists between consecutive neurons. What does this statement mean? If we're saying it is a gap simply means there's an empty space there. So let's try to look at the idea of a reflex arc. We know that when we talk about the reflex arc, we're focusing on the path that is taken by a nerve impulse in order to bring about a reflex action, right? So the reflex arc is going to start from the receptor. From the receptor, it is going to go into the sensory neuron, and from the sensory neuron, it will go into the interneuron. But what this statement suggests is that if we say this is the axon terminals of the sensory neuron, between the sensory neuron and the interneuron in the spinal cord, so let me write SN. SN, this is sensory neuron, and let me write IN, that is the interneuron. So I have that in mind. So if we say these are the axon terminals of the sensory neuron, and these are the dendrites of the interneuron, between the sensory neuron and the interneuron, there's going to be a microscopic gap. And this microscopic gap is what we're going to refer to as a synapse, right? So it exists between consecutive neurons. Now, why is this microscopic gap here? Now, this synapse is said to ensure one directional transmission of impulses. It makes sure that when impulses comes or are transmitted from the sensory neuron, they continue in that direction. Because remember, in order for you to be able to respond to the stimulus, these nerve impulses must be able to reach the effector. So the synapse is here to make sure that these nerve impulses continue in one direction towards the effector, so that they do not turn and change direction, right? So that is the function of this synapse. So it ensures one directional transmission of impulses. Itself, it is a microscopic gap that exists between consecutive neurons. But in this synapse, we are going to find what is called neurotransmitters. We are going to find chemicals that are called neurotransmitters. Now, these chemicals that we call neurotransmitters, they ensure that these nerve impulses are able to be transmitted from the sensory neuron to the interneuron. So remember, the nerve impulses, we said they are electrical in nature. So when they reach this synapse, they are able to be transmitted from the sensory to the interneuron by the mere fact that inside this synapse, we've got these chemicals that we call the neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are able to transmit the nerve impulse from the sensory to the inter. These are chemicals. They are found inside of a synapse. What is a synapse? It is a microscopic gap that exists between consecutive neurons. What is the function of this synapse? It ensures one directional transmission of impulses. So that is the main function of this synapse. It ensures one directional transmission of impulses. Now, when impulses have been successfully transferred from this sensory neuron to the interneuron, we say that these neurons have made what we call a synaptic contact. So communication across a synapse, we'll refer to it as a synaptic contact. This is when nerve impulses have been transferred successfully from one neuron to the next. So when they've been successfully transferred from one neuron to the next, we're going to say that the two neurons have made what we call a synaptic contact. So that is the idea of a synapse. Let's continue. Now let's try to look at these different structures of neurons, right? So let's try to come up with the names of these neurons first. We know that neuron number 1, looking at this structure, the cell body is in the middle. So because the cell body is in the middle, we know that this is a sensory neuron. You have to write it in full. I'm just lazy, so I'm going to write it as SN. Let's look at neuron number 2. Neuron number 2, the cell body is towards the end or towards the beginning of this neuron. So of course this is the motor neuron, right? Number 3, same, it looks like number 2, so we also call it a motor neuron. Number 4, the cell body is in the middle, so number 4 represents the sensory neuron. But looking at these diagrams, there is a very stark difference between these different types of neurons. For example, neuron 1 and neuron 4 are exactly the same type of neurons. They are both sensory neurons. Neuron 2 and neuron 4 are the same type of neurons. They are motor neurons. But between neuron 1 and neuron 4, there is a difference that we can note here. Neuron number 1 has got this part that we call the myelin sheath. But in neuron number 4, there is no myelin sheath. And this is significant. This is very important to note. Why? When we talk about the second function of the myelin sheath, we said that the myelin sheath is responsible for speeding up the transmission of nerve impulses. Therefore, in a sensory neuron that has got the myelin sheath, the transmission of nerve impulses is going to be very fast. But in a neuron that is without the myelin sheath, then the transmission of impulses is going to be slow. Why is it going to be slow? Because this neuron number 4 does not have the myelin sheath. And therefore, if it does not have the myelin sheath, the transmission of impulses here is not going to be sped up, since that is the function of the myelin sheath. Therefore, if we were to compare the transmission of impulses between neuron 1 and neuron 4, we're going to say that in neuron 1, the transmission of impulses is faster. And that is simply because it contains the myelin sheath. But in neuron number 4, the transmission of impulses is going to be very slow, and that is simply because it does not have the myelin sheath. Now, what are the consequences of this to the human body? Remember, we said that in order for there to be a reflex action, we define the reflex action as being a rapid and an automatic response to a stimulus. So in order for you to be able to lift your hand from the hot surface fast enough, the nerve impulses must be transmitted first of all from the receptor to the effector, and that transfer of impulses must occur very fast, right? So one of the parts that ensures that that transmission of impulse is fast is this part that we call the myelin sheath. So when the myelin sheath is present, the transmission of impulses is going to be very fast. And if the transmission of impulse is fast, then those nerve impulses will reach the effector faster. And if they reach the effector faster, it tells me that the reaction time is also going to be fast. So this limits bodily harm, right? So when your neurons have the myelin sheath, you are going to be harmed less. Why are you going to be harmed less? Because the transmission of impulses is going to be fast. And when the transmission of impulses is fast, it also tells me that the reaction time is also going to be fast. So you are going to be able to react very fast. So you are going to limit bodily harm. But in a person who has got neuron type number 4, where there is no myelin sheath, the transmission of those nerve impulses is going to be very slow. And if it is going to be very slow, it tells me that it is going to take longer for the nerve impulses to be transmitted from the sensory neuron to the effector. And if it is taking longer for those nerve impulses to be transmitted from the receptor to the effector, it tells me that the reaction time is also going to be slow. And if it is going to be slow, you are going to be hurt, right? So you are going to be hurt more when the neuron does not have a myelin sheath. Now, a neuron that has a myelin sheath, we refer to it as being myelinated. Myelinated simply describes a neuron that has the myelin sheath. But a neuron without the myelin sheath, we refer to it as being unmyelinated. Unmyelinated simply refers to a neuron without the myelin sheath. Now, the explanations will also apply to motor neurons 2 and motor neurons 4. Of course, in motor neuron 2, that is without the myelin sheath, we call it an unmyelinated neuron. And because it has no myelin sheath, then the transmission of impulse here is going to be very slow. Therefore, this person is going to be hurt more. But when we talk of individual number 3 with the myelin sheath, then the transmission of impulses here is going to be very fast. Therefore, this is going to limit bodily harm. This is going to limit injury because the impulses are going to be transmitted very fast. Right. Now, let's talk about a disorder that is present in the myelin sheath in neurons. Right. We've got a disorder that is called multiple sclerosis. We've got this disorder. It is referred to as multiple sclerosis. Now, when we talk about multiple sclerosis, this is a disorder of the nervous system wherein it causes the degeneration of the myelin sheath. It degrades. So if normally the myelin sheath looks like this, in a person that has got multiple sclerosis, you may find that this myelin sheath is tearing away, something like this. I'm not very good at drawing, but you'll find that it is tearing away. Some parts are missing of this myelin sheath. So this person, we say, has got what we call multiple sclerosis. It is caused by the degradation of the myelin sheath. So it will tear away or it will be drawn not uniformly as this, but you will see that there is a problem with this neuron. So we say this person has got a disorder that is called multiple sclerosis. Now, let's try to look at the impacts of multiple sclerosis on an individual. Now, since the multiple sclerosis affects the myelin sheath, and we also said that myelin sheath speeds up the transmission of impulses, it tells me that a person with multiple sclerosis, the transmission of impulses in their neurons is going to be slower simply because the myelin sheath are going to be damaged. They are going to be degraded. So the transmission of impulses is going to be very slow. Therefore, a person with multiple sclerosis will consequently have a slower reaction time. They will react very slowly simply because the impulses are being transmitted slowly. And if you react slowly because impulses are being transmitted slowly, that is going to increase bodily harm. That is going to increase injury. You are going to be hurt more simply because you are taking longer to react. And that is a consequence of having this disorder that we call multiple sclerosis. Right. Let's continue. Now let's look at, we've already focused on multiple sclerosis. The explanation is the same. So let's continue. Now let's talk about when neurons are damaged. Now what happens when neurons are damaged? Let's look at the sensory neuron first. Now the sensory neuron, we've already said that it is responsible for transmitting impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system, right? Now, when I talk about the sensory neuron, what I think about first is sensation. Sensation, this is the ability to feel. So I will think about the sensory neuron first. So let's say a person is involved in a car accident, right? When this person is involved in a car accident, it may be possible for them to be hurt very badly. Let's say their leg is broken. But when this person's leg is broken, that person, you'll find that he or she is unable to feel the pain from the breaking of their leg. But maybe they can still move the leg. What happened? How do we explain this in terms of neurons? We're going to say that if the sensory neuron is damaged, no nerve impulses are going to be transmitted from the receptor to the central nervous system. Now, if nerve impulses are unable to reach the central nervous system, it tells me that as a person, you are not going to be able to detect that stimulus. You are not going to be able to feel that stimulus. And if you are not able to feel the stimulus, therefore you are not going to be able to react. Therefore, there will be no reflex action taking place simply because you do not feel a thing. The same can apply to our example of cooking when you are touching a hot surface. If the sensory neuron is damaged, then the nerve impulses are not going to reach the central nervous system. If they do not reach the central nervous system, you are not going to feel that you are getting bent, so you will not detect the stimulus. And since you do not feel that you are getting bent, you are going to keep touching that hot surface. So when you are touching that hot surface, there is no reflex action. And since there is no reflection, you are going to be hurt more. So when the sensory neuron is damaged, you are going to be hurt more. Right? Simply because you won't detect the stimulus. Why won't you detect the stimulus? Because no nerve impulses are going to be transmitted from the receptor to the central nervous system, and therefore no reflex action is going to take place. Right. Let's keep the interneuron for now and focus on the motor neuron. Now, with the motor neuron, we said that the function of the motor neuron is to transmit impulses from the central nervous system to the effector. But if the motor neuron is damaged, it tells me that nerve impulses are not going to be transmitted from the central nervous system to the effector. They will not be transmitted. So if nerve impulses do not reach this effector, then you are not going to be able to respond to the stimulus. Again, let's talk about the hot pen. If you are touching that hot pen and only the motor neuron is damaged, which means the sensory neuron is not damaged but the motor neuron is damaged, what is going to happen is that since the sensory neuron is not damaged, then you are going to be able to detect that stimulus. This is because impulses will be able to be transmitted from the receptor to the central nervous system. Therefore, you are going to feel the pain. You are going to feel that heat. But when you are able to feel that heat, if this motor neuron is damaged, then those nerve impulses will not be able to be transmitted to the effector. So you are going to be able to feel the pain, but you will not be able to respond since those impulses are unable to reach the effector. So you will feel the pain, but you will be unable to respond to the pain. This is simply because the sensory neuron is not damaged, so it will continue to transmit impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system. But you will not be able to respond since those nerve impulses will not be able to reach the effectors. Therefore, you are going to get hurt. You are not going to be able to respond to that stimulus. Right? So this is when the motor neuron is damaged. So when the motor neuron is damaged, you are not able to respond to the stimulus. When we damage the sensory neuron, you are not able to detect the stimulus. You are not able to feel pain. Right? But when we damage the interneuron, now it becomes interesting. Because when you damage the interneuron, it will result in a loss of both sensation and an ability to react. Why is this the case? So the sensory neuron will not be able to transmit impulses to the interneuron, right? So when these impulses are not transmitted to the interneuron, you are not going to be able to detect that stimulus. You are not going to be able to feel the pain. But also, the nerve impulses are also not going to be able to be transmitted from the interneuron to the motor neuron. And since no impulses are being transmitted from the interneuron to the motor neuron, therefore also no reaction is going to take place since no impulses are being transmitted. So when you damage the interneuron, you lose both sensation and an ability to respond. But when you damage the sensory neuron only, you lose sensation. When you damage the motor neuron, you lose the ability to react. If you like what we've had to say, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Until next time, bye-bye.